Was Pope Benedict XVI proactive in the pedophile priest-clergy sex scandal? Unfortunately, the pedophile priest sex scandal dominated his pontificate, with many news media proclaiming that this was a stain on his pontificate. And the real question is, could Pope Benedict XVI have done more to resolve this issue? The first question to reflect on is this: why was the problem of pedophile priests allowed to fester so long? Was the hierarchy of the Church truly ignorant of these scandals that were developing? One culprit is, in the 60s, we had a misplaced confidence in psychology and the tendency to use psychology to explain away sinfulness. Too many people thought that pedophile priests could be cured simply by enrolling them in counseling and group therapy sessions, which time would reveal were nearly always futile. People involved in any kind of addictive behaviors are incredibly good liars. And everyone, which is nearly all of us who has been involved in an intimate relationship, knows that the participants want to keep their personal lives from prying eyes. Even today, when a priest is accused of being a pedophile, one primary piece of evidence is how many people come forward to accuse him. The other main culprit was that when totalitarian regimes in World War II and afterwards battled the Catholic Church, they always attacked them in the most vulnerable spots. And David Kurtzer spoke, The Pope at War. He describes the discussions that took place between Pope Pius XII and Ribbentrop, the Nazi Minister of Foreign Affairs. Kurtzer quotes Ribbentrop as saying that Hitler believed that settling their differences was quite possible, but depended on first ensuring that the Catholic clergy in Germany abandoned any kind of political activity, that is, not to offer any criticism, explicit or implicit, of government policies. Ribbentrop noted that Hitler had quashed no fewer than 7,000 indictments of Catholic clergymen, charged with a variety of financial and sexual crimes, and was continuing the government's policy of subsidizing the church, including paying the clerical salaries. And the Pope responded by saying that much was also being taken away from the church, including its educational institutions and its properties. And this issue of pedophile priest sex crimes was a charge made both by Hitler and after the war by communist authorities in Poland, home of the future of John Paul II, and many other communist leaders. And this discredited the accusation for many decades after the war. Were Hitler's accusations that many priests were pedophiles true? When David Kurtzer wrote the book, Pope and Mussolini, which accessed the Vatican archives of Pope Pius XI, he gave Pope Pius XII the benefit of the doubt. But in The Pope at War, which was written after the Vatican archives of Pope Pius XII, the wartime pope, were open to scholars by Pope Francis, Kurtzer saw correspondence and changed his mind about the culpability of the wartime pope. He asked the very poignant question: were many of these allegations of sexual misconduct by clergy true? Before examining Pope Benedict's role in this controversy, we first need to establish a timeline. Benedict timeline is this: 1927, the birth of Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI. 1951, ordained as a priest, and he served as a Catholic professor. Some decades later, 1977, he was appointed Archbishop of Munich and Freising. And 5 years later, he started serving in the Vatican. One of his posts was prefect of the CDF, which is short for the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, or CDF. As the pedophile priest scandal develops, the CDF assumes primary jurisdiction for these matters. Previously, these matters were handled locally in the individual dioceses. And of course, in 2013, Pope Benedict XVI resigns the papacy and dies nearly a decade later in 2022. Anyway, an excellent summary was provided when NPR asked Catholic Jesuit priest Thomas Reese, who was with the Religious News Service, how did Pope Benedict XVI handle the sex abuse scandal? And this is about the best summary we found. And he answers, well, nobody in the church handled the sex abuse crisis well. Certainly when Ratzinger, the future pope, was Archbishop of Munich, he did not do it very well. My guess is that he delegated the issue to his subordinates and didn't really pay much attention to it. But the good thing about Benedict was he grew in his understanding of the sex abuse crisis. And when he was in the Vatican, he was the first official to really take it seriously, much more seriously than Pope John Paul II did. And as head of the CDF, he was the guy who had to read the files. And he read the files, and he said, this guy's got to go. And he threw hundreds of priests out of the priesthood and realized that there was just no place in the Catholic Church for priests who had abused children. In 2001, Ratzinger convinced Pope John Paul II to put the CDF in charge of all sexual abuse investigations. According to John Allen, writing for the National Catholic Reporter, Ratzinger in the following years acquired a familiarity with the problem that virtually no other figure in the Catholic Church can claim. Disgusted by what he would later refer to as the filth in the Church, Ratzinger seems to have undergone something of a conversion experience from 2003 to 2004. From that point forward, he and his CDF staff seemed driven by a convert's zeal to clean up the mess. And George Weigel wrote his biography of Pope Benedict XVI in 2005 before the scandal had really exploded. He only mentions it briefly, but the scandal is mentioned more prominently in the recent biography written by Guerriero, which is blessed by a foreword by Pope Francis. When in 2001 the CDF assumed ultimate responsibility, providing global oversight over the pedophile priest problem, the rules were tightened. In particular, the Church was quicker to defrock offending priests. Whoever became aware of sexual abuse is now compelled to report it. They cannot keep it secret. Any bishop who becomes aware of a credible accusation is now compelled to conduct a preliminary investigation, and then he must inform the CDF. And the statute of limitations under canon law was extended to 10 years after the victim turned 18. And the biggest change was now victims of abuse encouraged that perhaps their complaints would not be ignored, turned to doctors, lawyers, public prosecutors, and journalists to expose the guilty priests. In the first year alone, 3,000 cases were investigated, mostly from America. Initially, dioceses settled out of court, but the number of cases were so overwhelming that many went to trial, and eventually some dioceses were forced to declare bankruptcy. Before this, guilty priests were simply quietly assigned to a distant parish, and that became increasingly impossible. And the first phase of the scandal mostly involved the United States, but it was Ireland's turn in 2006. The full scope of the Irish problem was not realized until 2009. Nearly 50 pedophile priests had been protected or gone unpunished by their bishops, who moved them secretly from parish to parish. In addition, over 2,500 orphan children were abused by priests and others working for the Church. All Irish bishops were summoned to Rome. All Irish bishops were compelled to face the Pope and the Curia, and the offending priests were tried by church tribunals. Pope Benedict XVI directly addressed the victims and the parents, acknowledging that the Church committed grave errors of judgment. Germany was next. Investigative journalists identified close to 100 pedophile priests. 30 had already been convicted. 10 of these were being tried in court. There were suspicions that Ratzinger himself was involved, but then it was discovered that the pedophile priest in his diocese was exposed after Ratzinger was promoted to the Vatican. His biography details some individual fantastic cases of prominent clergy found guilty of sexual crimes against both men and women, sometimes exposing secret wives and children, and you can read these at your leisure. Pope Benedict XVI broke precedent by personally meeting with many abuse victims, asking for their forgiveness, expressing the closeness of the Church to their sufferings, promising justice and solidarity. Almost as if to compensate for the lack of courage on the part of bishops and others in ecclesiastical authority, the Pope put himself on the front line, listening to the victims, weeping with them. And penance is what Christians do. Christians repent. Unfortunately, many secular media interpreted these gestures by Pope Benedict as an admission of his personal guilt. During this time, Cardinal Ratzinger confessed, "The greatest persecution of the Church comes not from her enemies without, but arises from sin within the Church. The Church has a deep need to relearn penance, to accept purification, to learn forgiveness on the one hand, but also the need for justice." Now, the media can be unfair at times, but Pope Benedict XVI said that we must be grateful for every disclosure. The truth combined with love rightly understood is primary. The media could not have reported these incidents had there not been evil in the Church herself. And Dr. Wikipedia states that in February 2022, Benedict admitted that errors were made in the treating of sexual abuse cases when he was Archbishop of Munich. According to the letter released by the Vatican, he asked forgiveness for any grievous fault but denied personal wrongdoing. Benedict stated, quoting from the BBC, "I have had great responsibilities in the Catholic Church. All the greater is my pain for the abuses and the errors that occurred in these different places during the time of my mandate." Now, will the sexual abuse stop? It will never stop. People will always be people, and secret affairs will always happen, though DNA tracking may decrease sexual assault somewhat. Worldwide, there are over 400,000 priests, so it would be impossible to ever totally eliminate this problem. People often have no idea how prevalent sexual assault and cheating are. I personally have been involved in divorce support and single-parent groups for decades, where I've gotten to know many young mothers. Based on my personal experience, I think that over 10% of women experience sexual assault, and this is a rough statistic that's confirmed elsewhere. Also, when doctors perform DNA tests for medical reasons, they discover that roughly 1 in 20 children have misattributed paternity, which means that their biological father differs. Also, our family was involved in the swim scene many years ago. I personally know of 2 coaches who were fooling around with the girls who were coaching, and there were likely more. The swim scene is notorious for sexual abuse, since the programs are run year-round. Plus, we must keep in mind that one reason why Catholic parishes seem to have a great problem with sexual scandals is that the Catholic Church is guilty of keeping national centralized personnel files. Now, on the other extreme, evangelical churches seem to have fewer sexual abuse cases, although they do occasionally generate scandals, because they're congregational, which means that each congregation maintains its own personnel records, and the centralized office in a congregational church mainly holds conventions, runs the seminaries, and sells books. It has nothing to do with the member churches. So we will return to the main question. In hindsight, could Pope Benedict XVI have done more for the victims of clerical abuse? And of course, in hindsight, Pope Benedict XVI could have done more. We know he did do more once he realized the scope and severity of the problem. And the question reminds me of the closing scene of Spielberg's movie, Schindler's List, when the good Nazi businessman Oskar Schindler, now nearly broke from trying to save as many Jews as he could, breaks down in tears before his rabbi, whose life he saved, as well as many other Jews in his factory. We could have saved more. Why didn't we save more Jews? Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Our primary source is this recently published biography, Benedict XVI, His Life and Thought, which is blessed by a foreword by Pope Francis, and it's comprehensive and easy to read. We also have a book review video on the various books we consult for our studies on the Second Vatican Council. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.